It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this event. Throughout its history, the University of Chicago has embraced and defended the value of intense inquiry and informed argument. During a nationwide attack in the 1930s on communist propaganda in American universities, which called out the University of Chicago in particular, Robert Maynard Hutchins spoke boldly of our fundamental values. The answer to such charges is not denial, nor evasion, nor apology. Rather, it is the assertion that free inquiry is indispensable to the good life, that universities exist for the sake of such inquiry, and that without it they cease to be universities, and that such inquiry and hence universities are more necessary now than ever. But free speech is not easy. We will explore today tensions related to creating and sustaining an environment that allows for open, rigorous, and intense intellectual inquiry and debate, while at the same time fostering civil discourse both on campus and in the classroom. We are fortunate now to have 4 members of our community who have thought deeply about these issues and who will help us refine our thinking. Geoff Stone from the law school, from whose book Perilous Times I obtained the Hutchins quote, Margie Mitchell from the Divinity School, Ramón Gutiérrez from History and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and our moderator Mark Hansen, Dean of the Social Sciences Division. I look forward to their discussion and your questions and participation. Mark.
Well, thank you all of you for being here this afternoon, and welcome. It seems that issues of free speech and free expression are always with us in the university, and the past couple of years have been no exception to that. That's unsurprising, of course, because as a university, in many ways, we're all about speech and expression, and so it should come as no surprise that those are issues that we live with every day. But as Tom mentioned, there is always the question of how one maintains an environment where free speech and free expression can flourish at the same time as we have a community that deeply values openness and mutual respect as well. These were questions that were posed to a university committee in the 1960s, at the height of all the social activism of the 1960s, a committee that was headed up by the law professor Harry Kalven Jr., and included 6 or 7 additional distinguished but there are additional copies as well in the back of the Kalven report that resulted from the deliberations of this body. What I thought would be interesting to do today is to engage the panel, first of all, in some preset questions. I'm going to pose some hypotheticals, situations to the panelists in pairs and singly, as a way of beginning to generate some thinking about the issues that engaged the Kalven Committee back some 40 years ago. And the way I'm going to structure that is that I want to pull out some quotations from the Kalven report that I found particularly evocative or provocative, in hopes that it might help to structure, to use the way that they structured their thinking about free speech and free expression in the university in the 1960s, to engage those same issues here in the first decade of the 21st century. Before I do that, though, let me give a little bit more complete introduction of our 3 distinguished panelists who are going to help us think through these issues. First of all, on my far left, Ramón Gutiérrez. Ramón is the Preston and Sterling Morton Distinguished Service Professor in History in the college and also the Director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Ramón also is an experienced university administrator. Before he joined the University of Chicago faculty, he was Associate Chancellor at the University of California at San Diego. Ramón is a distinguished scholar of Chicano history, of race and ethnicity in American life, and of Indian and white relations in the Americas. In the center is Margaret Mitchell. Margaret is Professor of New Testament and Early Christian Literature at the Divinity School. She studies the relationship of New Testament and early Christian writings to the wider Greco-Roman world in which they were composed, and the legacies of those texts for the Christian communities in later antiquity and beyond. And finally, to my immediate left, Geoffrey Stone. Geoff is the former Harry Kalven Jr. professor and now the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor in the law school and the college, the editor of the Supreme Court Review, the former provost of the University of Chicago, and an authority in constitutional law and civil liberties, especially the First Amendment and free speech. So to get us going, as I indicated, what I want to do is to pose some hypotheticals to the panel, either singly or in pairs. These are hypotheticals that have been chosen, written in many ways, to engage some of the issues that were addressed 40 years ago by the Kalven Report. And after we've had a chance to do that, I want to open up to your questions and your comments and a more general discussion about issues of free speech and free expression in the university. So let me begin here. The Kalven Report concludes at one paragraph. A good university, like Socrates, will be upsetting. But is there a limit to how upsetting? Oftentimes, speech is very upsetting. So let me pose this question, and I'll begin with Margaret and then ask Ramón to address it as well. Suppose a faculty member openly criticizes key tenets of Islam in class. What if he also characterizes Muslim believers as ignorant and bloodthirsty? And do one's intuitions about the situation change at all if it's Christianity and Christians who are being referred to rather than Islam and Muslims? Is there a free speech problem? Is there a problem with speech that is too upsetting? Margaret?
Well, let me say at the outset, I'm going to answer this in relation to Christianity, since that's what I teach, and others can take it up. I teach ancient Christianity and biblical studies. 4 quick, I hope, points. The first is that no system of thought or practice, whether it's a philosophy, an ideology, a political stance, or a religion, is beyond criticism at the university. I take that just as a principle, that just because something is a religion doesn't mean it can't be critiqued. Everything should be under critique. But critique should be, within the context of the university, a critique that is befitting scholars. So it should be subtle. It should be a grained critique. It should be historically grounded. It should be subject to assessment and subject to further argument and discussion. It seems to me that the way the question is posed, and this is my second point, is that there are several distinctions in view. One is, what does it mean to critique the tenets of a particular religious position vis-a-vis critiquing individuals who happen to be aligned with that position? And a second is, what is the relationship between invective and argument? And it would seem to me that bloodthirsty and ignorant and bloodthirsty are not yet an argument. They are invective. They might become an argument, they might be situated in an argument, but as such they are at that point only a matter of invective. So third point, it seems to me the problem here is with the generalizations. And let me problematize them just very quickly. Tenets of Christianity, from the point of view of a professor who would make such a critique on that general scale, tenets of Christianity could mean a million different things. Christianity isn't a single thing. And what I would hope is both that a professor at the university, but also that any student in the class would, in the context of a liberal education, understand that any religious tradition is an organic, evolving thing that has many representatives in it. The problem, both on the part of the speaker, though, and on the part of the recipient, is that a hearer who gets upset, in the words of the report, is making the same problem in the other direction, that anything that is a detraction of anything in Christianity is anti-Christian, therefore anti-me. These are a series of assumptions that I think have to be questioned. And so again, what one would hope is that someone wouldn't just get upset, but rather would be ready for argument, to move from invective into argument. The idea here is not just indignation, but where is this conversation going within which these statements have been made. So it seems to me, last point, and there are many examples we could take up in the question and answer to really make this stick home. But the real issue for me here is not if it's permissible for the professor to make such a statement, but rather where is the conversation going to go from there? Is it going to be a conversation, and is it going to be a finely grained discussion of this particular element, of this particular religious tradition as instantiated by these persons in this place? So that's where I would take the question.
Ramón?
I would answer the question in the following way. Every university that I know of has a professional code of conduct for its faculty, that essentially gives them the academic freedom to teach without any interference, but to teach essentially in accurate and intellectually honest ways, in ways that foster learning, and in ways that generate a critical self-exploration and discovery. But that freedom also has a certain number of responsibilities attached to it that faculty are responsible. They must remain focused on the subject of their course and teach that course accurately. They have to create a civil learning environment so that ideas can be debated and discussed with mutual respect. And they have to allow students to hold different ideas and to explore them fully without any fear of retaliation or punishment. Now, for such a learning environment to happen at a university, I think it also has to be free of external pressure and external provocateurs. And I give you the case of Columbia University's Middle Eastern Studies Department that for the last 4 years has been under intense assault from external provocateurs, from organizations like Campus Watch that fund students to actually go to the classes of liberal professors, to record them, to engage in fractious debate with those professors to disrupt the class. Similarly, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, does similar things, asking students and professors to essentially monitor their colleagues and to report them. Now, for me, so if a professor openly criticizes any key tenet of Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, or for that matter, any other religion, I'd say the person is playing with fire. 97% of Americans believe in God. 87% of Americans pray daily. When Americans were asked recently what was the most important historical book they had read, it was the Bible, something that George Bush uttered in 1999 at the presidential debates. When Americans were asked who was the most important historical figure in the history of the United States, the grand majority of them responded that Jesus Christ. And so we have a very religious society, and when what enters into the classroom to criticize members of a particular religion as bloodthirsty and essentially ignorant, one has to be prepared to think of this only as a teaching moment. That is, why would you engage in such a debate unless you saw it as an opportunity to explore with your students what it means to be a member of a particular religion, what it means to explore the whole range of attitudes that exist within a particular religion, either as a political movement or as a system of faith, and to use it essentially to explore it in that fashion. I would always either preface or end such a conversation by saying this was a teaching moment. I did this explicitly to provoke you into exploring your own ideas and beliefs. Now, if a professor is uttering such nonsense as common sense in a biology or a physics or a chemistry class, I would say that in fact this professor is shirking his or her responsibilities to teach in an accurate and meaningful way, to draw students into meaningful conversations, and I would think it would be, in my mind, unsavory and something that students and faculty and administrators could complain about. I'd say those are the, I'd also say maybe it was time for that professor to think about taking a world religion class so that he or she could learn a little bit more about the topic that they're pontificating upon and that they clearly know nothing about, because blood feuds, religious hatreds, and religious ignorance are hallmarks of human civilization for at all times and all periods. It's not unique in our own moments.
Let me turn to a little bit different issue with free speech and free expression, also addressed in the Kalven report. A short way down from the quotation I opened with is the quotation, the assertion on the part of the writers of the Kalven report: the university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not the critic itself. But what does it mean for the university not itself to be the critic? So let me pose this question for Geoff Stone. Suppose an academic center sponsors an event at which all the speakers assail the government of Turkey, and for that matter the Western governments and international organizations, for their unwillingness to characterize the actions against the Armenians in 1915 as a genocide. Should this be subject to sanction? What if the speakers attribute base motives to Turkey and its supporters, such as a conspiracy to extirpate Orthodox Christianity from the region? What if the center never sponsored a single event that includes speakers who support the official view in Turkey, even though they've been repeatedly approached by pro-Turkish organizations seeking co-sponsorship for such events? Jeff?
So the basic question here is, what is the legitimate role of the university in terms of having a position itself? And a core premise of the Kalven Report is that the university is not a participant in public discourse or in endorsing particular positions. Its function is to enable scholars, teachers, students to debate those issues without the university itself taking a position. And that would mean, for example, that the university could not legitimately, under the Kalven Report, take a view about, say, the war in Iraq, or abortion, or school prayer. It would simply be an illegitimate act of the university. Faculty members, students can say whatever they want on those questions. They can debate those issues to their heart's content. And the goal of the university is not to have an official position, but to be hospitable to the promulgation and the articulation of as many different perspectives on those issues as possible. The question posed by Mark's hypothetical is, when does an entity within the university cross that line? At what point is the university itself, or a department or center or school or division, taking a position as opposed to simply facilitating people to debate the position? And it seems to me, on the terms of this hypothetical, there would be no aspect of this that would demonstrate a violation of the Kalven Report. One of the functions of parts of the university is to sponsor programs, conferences, symposia, debates, and their purpose in doing so could be manyfold, but one of them is simply to expose members of the community to ideas. One version of structuring such a conference or symposium is to have an array of different speakers with different points of view to create debate among the speakers. Another may be to enable a particular perspective to be presented on a question without trying to do the entire range of ideas. I have no idea, for example, whether the three of us are perceived as having different views or similar views on the kinds of issues we're discussing. And I would assume that it would not be asserted that this program was illegitimate because all of us at some level will defend academic freedom. So I think that an individual event, if promoted in the spirit of a broadly defined responsibility to present ideas to the community, can almost never violate this aspect of the Kalven Report. The final version of the hypothetical that Mark presents is, well, suppose this center or department has never had a conference or symposium that presents the other side, so that its only presentation is that abortion is immoral, and it never has panels that suggest that abortion is moral. Is that a violation of the Kalven Report? Well, it could be, depending essentially on the motive of the hosting unit of the university. If there is a credible explanation that the unit has simply made choices about how to present conferences or symposia or speakers in order to best serve the educational interest of the community, it would not be illegitimate that they all happen to be on one side of the question if that serves a reasonable understanding of the best way to provoke and present ideas. If, on the other hand, the unit itself is structuring these events in order to promote its own view, then that could well violate the Kalven Report. So a simple example with this would be if a department or center endorses a position that, for example, abortion is immoral, and it declares that. That would be no different than the university declaring it, and it would be impermissible. Similarly, for a unit of the university to have an event, the motivation through which is to persuade people that there is a right position, and that's the position being advocated at the conference, that would be a violation of the Kalven Report. But as a general matter, motivations are very obscure, You've got many different actors planning events. They have very different motivations. It's exceedingly difficult to know what is the motivation of a multi-member group. And therefore, I think all of the inferences should be drawn in favor of assuming academic freedom and not assuming that the department or the center is acting in a way that violates the precepts of the report. But if there is a violation, if it's clear that the motivation was in fact to proselytize on a particular issue that the unit deems to be official, then that would be a violation of the report, and I think those who were responsible for it could appropriately be disciplined for misusing the university's authority.
Thank you. Last, I want to move from the focus of the Kalven report on the university as speaker or the university as political actor and move toward a focus that is also part of the Kalven report on members of the university, students and faculty as speakers and as expressors of viewpoints. The Kalven report says the following: the neutrality of the university arises out of respect for free inquiry and the obligation to cherish a diversity of viewpoints. And this neutrality as an institution has its complement in the fullest freedom for its faculty and students as individuals to participate in political action and social protest. And so with those words in mind, ought any of the following actions or expressions, if you will, be subject to sanction? And I'm simply going to read out a few of them. You'll notice a kind of religion theme here. It was kind of popular with some members of the panel. So ought any of the following to be prohibited or to be sanctioned? A student wears a t-shirt to class with a drawing of Jesus on the cross and the words, "Hang in there, baby." What if it's a religion class? What if the wearer is the instructor? What if the caption instead reads, "His blood be on us and on our children," from Matthew 25, one source of the blood libel against Jews? What if the same drawing is posted on a faculty office door? What if the same drawing hangs behind the desk of the department secretary? Are any of these subject to sanction? Let me begin with Ramón this time.
First of all, I'd say that I disagree with the Kalven report in thinking that the university is neutral, and that anything that it does is neutral, but that's a different debate. Now, whether a student wears a t-shirt saying, "Just hang in there, baby," with a crucifix on it, I would say that it all depends. It might be a mindful act, and it might not be, and it might be a malicious act. I know every day I get up, the shirt I wear depends largely on what I have that's clean in my wardrobe. It could be that a student is wearing a particular t-shirt that has been given as a gift and wants to show that appreciation for that gift to the giver sometime during the course of the day. All of those things would be certainly difficult to interpret. Now, a friend of mine recently died after having had cancer for 10 years. And before he died, we had a number of conversations about death. And he had not been brought up in a religious tradition, and he constantly said to me that he was very afraid of dying because he didn't know what would happen after death. And he said, "Was I frightened by death?" And I said, "Look, Tim," which is his name, I said, "I was raised as a Roman Catholic in a very strict household, and since the earliest memories that I have, I was worshiping a man God up on a cross who was dead, who was essentially suffering from pain. And the lesson that I was supposed to gain from this was that quiet suffering, that the endurance of pain, that essentially death would be triumph over life, and that it would allow for resurrection and reconciliation." And so for me, the only death was not frightening in the least. Rather, it was a glorious transition into the afterlife, which would, I hope, bring some kind of resurrection of the body and soul someday. But the only thing I wish for is that death not be slow or that it not be painful as I go. So in a sense, we all have very different attitudes about death and what the crucifix may mean. Now, if a student were wearing such a shirt to a class, I would probably use it as an opportunity to teach, again, to use it as a teachable moment, to talk about the way in which students reflect their own personal religious devotion by using religious symbols, wearing crosses around their necks, wearing yarmulkes, Sikhs wearing turbans, Muslim women wearing scarves. All of these are religious symbols that people use in order to express their sense of connection to a religion, their particular religious devotion. So again, I would use it as a moment to discuss how those symbols are used in our society. Now, if it were a professor using such a T-shirt to class, again, I would think it would be highly inappropriate and distasteful if the professor is simply using it to provoke without having any responsibility for discussing the provocation. That is, if he's simply using it to insult his students or her students, then to me it would be inappropriate. But if the purpose that the professor is wearing such a shirt is simply to engage in conversation, to provoke conversation about why people are insulted by this shirt, what does religion mean to them, what does the crucifixion mean in our public culture, then to me that would be highly appropriate. Now, if the professor had a similar drawing on his or her doorway, then to me it's not, it's a personal expression of whatever it may be behind the actions of this individual. For me, the more suspect and objectionable thing is if a department secretary or a university employee has such a drawing or such a T-shirt that's being prominently displayed at their desk. To me, the privileges of academic freedom and its responsibilities are for faculty and students, and at most institutions, most businesses, employees are not allowed to take political positions, are not allowed to advocate for particular political causes, are not allowed to demonstrate their own personal religious symbols. And in this case, I'd say that the individual might be, the supervisor might want to discuss with this individual why they have such pictures or drawings around their desk.
Margaret?
It's a great question, and I appreciate your answer very much, Ramon. I would say flat out, none of those should be prohibited. I do think that what we have here is a clash of paradigms, and I mean, this is very, very relevant to how I teach and what I teach, so I'll come back around to the classroom. But per se, they can't be prohibited. I would say because what is really so gripping and sort of emotionally charged about these examples is that they get into the terrain of blasphemy or sacrilege. And neither blasphemy nor sacrilege are categories that the university works with. That is, that we don't, that's not a line that we draw. We draw a line about academic freedom, but we also draw another line about civility. And civility has to do with how one wants to function as a member of a community, and someone who takes certain stands, either in the T-shirts that they wear or the art that they like and so on, is risking forms of civility with other members of the community, it would seem to me, in certain contexts. Now, in terms of the classroom, I have never worn such a T-shirt, but I have done things like the following. I have put up PowerPoint slides of a 3rd century Roman graffito which shows a figure on a cross with an ass's head and a little man at the bottom looking up, and the Greek inscription says, Alexamenos worships his god. And I use that in order to illustrate how, from the point of view of a non-Christian, and I'm not going to use the word pagan, what I would say is really from the point of view of the majority culture, this message about the crucified Jesus was an absolute incomprehensible thing. And so that graffito, I think, has a place in my classroom to instruct in that regard. In terms of Matthew 27:25 and the statement, his blood be on us and on our children, I think it's a responsibility of mine as a teacher of New Testament texts to teach in such a way that the impact of those statements in the history of reception, including the complicity of those statements in Christian anti-Judaism, I think myself that has to be a part of not just the implicit curriculum of my class, but that I need to address it directly. So it doesn't have to be on someone's T-shirt in order to get it onto the screen. It's onto the screen already. But if someone came into my class with that on their T-shirt, they would expect a conversation. They wouldn't only be doing it just accidentally, oops, I landed in this classroom this way. Because I begin all of my classes with the students having to take some position themselves as to where do they stand vis-a-vis these texts that are sacred for some communities and not for others. And will they, and this is the only prerequisite in my Introduction to New Testament course, is are they willing to engage in conversation with like and non-like-minded others? Now, if you want to engage in conversation, such a T-shirt may not help if there are certain people you want to be in conversation with who would be offended by hang in there baby t-shirt. But I do think that any act of biblical interpretation is indeed a teachable moment, and for me that's what I'm teaching all the time, so it's right on target. But civility does dictate, or not dictate, civility indicates that we as individuals in this community make choices about who we want to be in conversation with and where we want to cut off conversation. I think the staff member is in some ways the hardest, because our staff are and aren't part of the conversation in the same way. I mean, in fact, the Kalven report says that academic freedom, I think something like that the instrument of dissent and criticism is the individual faculty member or the individual student, and it doesn't mention staff members, but they are, by virtue of living here and dedicating their professional lives to the mission of the university, they're a part of the conversation, but their avenues for expressing themselves in that conversation are curtailed in various ways. So that is an act of speech, and I'm not quite sure how one would deal with it, but I think I would deal with it by engaging that staff member in conversation, certainly, and not by tiptoeing around it. I think it is an act that's meant to generate a response, and I would want to honor that with a response.
Let me pose one last hypothetical to Jeff, and this on the rights and responsibilities of members of the faculty. Suppose a faculty member justifies violence against doctors who perform abortions and speaks at events at which he identifies himself as a University of Chicago faculty member. Should he be told that he cannot identify himself as a member of the faculty? Should his advocacy be considered in making recommendations, say, for salary raises? And does it matter in thinking about this issue whether his expertise is in mathematics or in ethics?
This was a huge struggle in the formulation of the concept of academic freedom. Does academic freedom apply only to what the faculty member says in the classroom and what she writes in her scholarship? Or does it apply beyond the four walls of the university to other forms of activities? A modern example of this, contemporary example of this, would be John Yoo, the law professor at Berkeley, who, working for the Bush administration, participated in the writing of the torture memos. One question is, can the University of California dismiss him because they believe that his work in the Department of Justice was bad lawyering, and in any event not protected by academic freedom, because he was not doing it as an employee of the University of California. He was doing it while he was on leave from the university. So this question of whether a faculty member who gets on a TV show and is interviewed or writes an op-ed for a newspaper or gives a speech on some other matter is protected by the umbrella of academic freedom was a real battle. The early definition of academic freedom was narrow, and it extended only to the activities of the faculty member that were specifically part of the responsibilities that she took on as a member of the faculty. But by the 1920s and 30s, the concept of academic freedom broadened, largely because of the self-interest of faculty members, to be extended to reach pretty much anything a faculty member says, insofar as the university is thinking of disciplining the faculty member for the ideas or views that she communicates. There's nothing inherently logical about that extension. One could actually limit the idea of academic freedom in a principled way, but of course there's a serious slippery slope problem, because we recognize that faculty members will do many things beyond the four corners of the university that are really an expression of what they learn, what they think about, what they believe, and conveys ideas as part of the public discourse, whether they're scientists or historians or law professors, that are valuable to the university and valuable to the society. And so with that recognition, the idea that what members of the community say outside the university has been broadened to include these kinds of extra academic statements. And this principle has then gone beyond that to say, well, even if you're a mathematician spouting off about abortion doctors, The university doesn't want to do the business of drawing lines. That to decide what's the appropriate discourse by a historian on certain issues relative to a mathematician on certain issues would involve the university in enforcing academic freedom in the kinds of questions that are very uncomfortable. And essentially universities have, for the most part, therefore taken the view that whatever faculty members say in public discourse is protected by academic freedom. And a good example of this would be, say, the communist era that Mark adverted to at the beginning. When faculty members signed petitions, for example, that were seen as communist in their orientation, or during the civil rights movement, when they participated in marches that were held to be illegal, or during the anti-war movement during the 1960s and 70s, when they participated in anti-war marches, which could be regarded as unlawful. It became pretty clear that the university didn't want to get in the business of saying that's beyond the boundaries of academic freedom. So the basic, very strong presumption would be that this speaker might be saying something that many of us would loathe, but it's clearly protected by the First Amendment, and university academic freedom should reach at least as far as the First Amendment, and this speaker would clearly be protected by academic freedom.
Your questions, your comments? Way in the back.
Mark has made just a little bit ago question whether the university was not a neutral institution. And I'd like to raise the question as to what the city feels about that. The controversy here got intense over the issue of universities' investments in South Africa. However, in those discussions, no one has ever raised the point, has anyone questioned the university on its investments during the Second World War, investments in the Holocaust, basically, in Germany. So, what I'm trying to do is throw out a hypothetical that makes the issue as stark as possible. But is it possible that we need to rethink idea that the university is wholly neutral, and it's only the faculty as individuals, the students as individuals, who are moral or political figures?
No person or institution can ever be wholly neutral. Everything we do in our lives is the reflection in some way of our beliefs and attitudes. So whether the university chooses to buy goods from a union-organized or non-unionized shop has impacts on the world. And that, if it makes a decision along those lines, it could be seen as non-neutral. So I don't think that the claim is that the university is absolutely neutral, any more than any of us is absolutely neutral. The claim of the Kalven report is that the university should aspire to be as neutral as possible in taking positions itself, knowing intentional positions itself, on matters of public moment. And that is an aspiration that I think is perfectly credible. It's impossible to achieve perfection, but it's something one can reach towards and try to achieve. And I think that's what the Kalven report is talking about. It's not that the university doesn't have effects on the world. It certainly does, and it can't avoid having effects. And some of those effects will undoubtedly be the result of judgments about wisdom and business efficiency and all sorts of things. The issue is whether the university is espousing a point of view. And there, I think the effort to be as neutral as possible is an admirable aspiration. Second of all, with respect to the Holocaust example, of course, one problem is because that was before the Kalven report. So the university was reaching towards this notion of itself, but it didn't have a fixed principle on this issue until the late 1960s. But let's take the point you really want to make, is aren't there really such hard cases that you simply could not be willing to live up to the aspiration for neutrality? Wouldn't you, in fact, disinvest in a country that was engaging in genocide and world war against the United States at the same time, because you don't want to be seen as taking a position on whether it is genocide or whether the war was justified, or whether there are better ways of achieving the end of the policy other than disinvestment, that you just felt you could not possibly morally sustain the position. So the best answer I give to that is that you don't want to make policies to anticipate the absolute worst case scenario. It's a very bad way to make law, and it's a very bad way to make rules. Because if you do that, you wind up opening the door to all sorts of bad results because you're worried about the situation that may never actually happen. So a good example of this is the torture debate. So people will say, wouldn't you engage in torture if there was if you knew there was a nuclear weapon in the Empire State Building and you knew it was going to go off within 12 hours and you had a terrorist who knew where the bomb was and you couldn't otherwise find it, and wouldn't you pull off his fingernails and kill his children in front of him in order to get him to tell you where the bomb is? And of course the answer is, yeah, you would. But you don't want to make a rule that says that. Because as soon as you make a rule that says that, you invite all sorts of other situations to be justified. And so it's very common in rulemaking to recognize that the rule you're making is overbroad, that it attempts to state an absolute, when in reality you know that if that ticking time bomb case ever really comes, you won't follow the rule. And that's okay, and you deal with it if it ever happens. And if somebody violates the rule, you either punish them or you don't punish them. You create an exception to the rule after the fact, but you don't actually expect people to follow the rule because they won't in that situation. So the simple answer, I think, is what the Kalven report is trying to do is to strive towards reaching the right result in the 99.9% of cases that actually arise in the real world, not making an explicit exception for the hypothetical that probably we'll never encounter, and that if it ever does really happen, we'll worry about it then.
Ramón or Margaret, would you like to address that?
Well, just a very small thing. I mean, I think that's a more than adequate response to the question, John. But what I would add to it just a little bit is that I think the second page of the Kalven report is rather interesting in the way in which it conceives of the university as a deliberative body, but as a deliberative body that deliberates in terms of the corporate whole only from time to time. In other words, that there are judgments that at certain critical moments that the university should exercise its corporate authority in a particular way. But I think that that's actually prudent. I mean, I understand the prudence of that for a variety of reasons, the main one of which is stated at the top of the second page, which is that the university does have certain business in trying to educate a public for the work of deliberation that is carried out in society in a whole variety of other places. And should we try to do all of that inside the university itself, I think that would be our 100% our vocation. That's what we would be doing all the time. And so I think there is some prudence in saying it's not just neutrality, but it's also a judgment about the relationship between the individual and the corporate body of the university in how it can affect public policy on a larger scale.
The only thing I would add to that is that the way in which the university contracts business relationships with anyone, the way in which research is funded, the way in which the national laboratories that we manage are accept or reject types of research projects that go on in them, the way in which students are allowed to unionize or not to unionize are not neutral things. I think my own experience in an institution where shared governance was much stronger, the faculty had a greater voice in making sure that there was extensive debate about all those decisions. I'll give you one concrete example. The Department of Homeland Security gave us a large grant at the University of California, San Diego to do research on how to electrify the fence separating the Mexican-US border. And the idea was how to charge this fence with enough electrical current that it would stun a person, but it wouldn't kill them. Now, we were particularly concerned about the calibration, the initial calibration of that fence to make sure that somebody wasn't going to get killed. And ultimately, it provoked such a huge debate among the faculty, students, and community that the university turned down the research grant. But every day, universities decide which endowments and which gifts they're going to accept, and many of those things often put their finger on the scale in one direction or another. So I don't pretend that it's a neutral institution. It aspires to be, and it's an aspirational statement, but in its daily operation, I think it's a little more complicated.
I do think it's important to understand this notion of neutrality. There's a difference between being neutral in the decisions you make and being neutral in your expression of views. So because the university is a business, it has to make decisions. And those decisions obviously are not always neutral. So the decision to add an engineering school or not is not neutral. It's a decision. Is engineering important? Is it not important? Is it essential to university? Is it not essential to university? The decision whether to create an engineering school is not thought by anyone to be a violation of the Kalven Report. For the university to say, as it's in its own voice, that university shouldn't have engineering schools would be a violation of the Kalven Report. There's a difference between deciding things, which can never be neutral, and expression. And the second point I want to make is it is important to understand in the context of, say, the Darfur issue or the South Africa issue, that the Kalven Report does have a complicated message in it that is designed to state the difference between acts that have significant consequences and expression. And so, for example, if the university's decision to invest in companies that do business in the Sudan would in fact demonstrably have a substantial impact on the continued existence of a genocidal policy, then that would be on the side of the decision of a matter that has direct consequence. And it wouldn't only be a decision about speech. So part of the argument that's made in the context of an issue like the genocide one is the university actually, in fact, causing the genocide? Or is it simply making a statement symbolically in its disinvestment? And the reality in the context of issues like Darfur and South Africa is that the university's investments in those places were trivial. And therefore, the only justification for disinvesting was to communicate a message about what the university believes is happening in the world and what people and institutions should believe about it. That's very different from the university actually causing things happen in the real world, where in fact the issue would be more complicated, more like the questions that Ramon's raising. So these are built into the Kalven Report, and they're very difficult questions. But there is a difference between decisions about running a university and having direct impact in the world and simply taking positions for the sake of taking positions.
Would the decision by the university to be involved in the Manhattan project?
That would be like an engineering school. The university's view on that would be like, well, we have an engineering school or we don't. We engage in the Manhattan project. It is a position. You're making a decision. But it's not a decision that's speech. It's not saying nobody can criticize the Manhattan project. It's not saying that nuclear weaponry is a good thing as a statement. It's making a decision, like we're going to be located in Chicago. Or, we're going to provide police protection south of 63rd Street. Or we're not going to provide police protection south of 63rd Street. Those are decisions. They're not neutral decisions. But they're also not speech by the university. They tell you things about decisions, but that's different from speech. In the same way that, you're getting up and putting on that vest this morning to communicate something about your taste. It wasn't your purpose, it wasn't your intent, but it does. That's not speech.
Thank you. Professor Mitchell, I'm interested in what you were saying about how professors should not be prohibited from expressing opinions. Professor Mitchell, you were talking about how there shouldn't be a prohibition against certain T-shirts and certain expressions, and that makes sense to me on the level of academic freedom. But I think I make a distinction in my mind between technical freedom, that professors should not be prohibited or limited, and on the other hand, kind of the issue of professional ethics and how you conduct your craft as a professor. If I could use a personal example from a class I had with Professor Mitchell last year, I was surprised one day because on your backpack you had, during the campaign, you had a political button. It happened to be a button the sentiment of which I agreed with. But I remember feeling, well, what if I didn't agree with this? And what if I had a different political position? Would that interfere with the learning process for me at all? And I think the question I'm trying to build to is, I think I find myself to be very uncomfortable with professors as political actors. We know there are professors out there who are very political, it seems to me anyway, in their work, their career, the positions they take. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on, it's one thing to say, okay, there's academic freedom where people are not going to lose their jobs, they're not going to be punished, they're not going to be prohibited. But it's another thing to talk about, does a professor have to really work very, very hard to maintain a position of neutrality on issues in order to have the educational process be most effective, open, free, and so that the best kind of learning can take place?
Well, I think, Gary, you've named, yes, of course a professor has to work very hard to maintain a public persona that both models inquiry and at some point models decision-making. I mean, that merely to be able to tell the men and the dead on every case, it's one side on the other. I mean, at a certain point, as a human being and as a citizen, I do make decisions and choices. I don't know if this is, this may sound a little casuistical, but my Obama button was always on my coat. I never taught with it on. Now it's hanging on the hook and it's in the room, but in my office, when students wanted to talk politics, and there were a lot of students on this campus who worked on the campaign, and we would talk about our experiences and so on, I would always say, we're now having a different kind of conversation. Now, whether you think that is enough, I mean, I would be willing to debate and discuss, but I would say that I'm not now speaking as your professor. I'm speaking as a citizen. And as a citizen, this is how I see the campaign, and let's talk about what our experiences are. Now, I didn't say to every student who saw me on the street, I'm willing to talk to you if you don't like my button, and so you could argue that's only half the conversation or even a third of it. But to the main point of your question, that does a professor have to work hard to maintain a position? Yes, because I am to be a professor for students from all different perspectives on this campus, and the choices that I make might limit my ability as an educator. And so I'm quite conscious of that. I may not always make the right decisions. But on the other hand, I have to be a human being too, and so you have to work that line. Same as you, however. You make decisions about what part of your life you make a part of your life in this community. Students have the same issue, but in different ways as according to, and I think the authority of a professor cuts in different ways. We grade and you don't, and other kinds of.
I would only add to that I would have been very upset if Professor Mitchell had said, we're not having class today because we're going to go work on the Obama campaign, which some professors do, and which I think is irresponsible. I mean, if it's a politics class and you're taking a class on how to organize political campaigns, or how to do grassroots organizing, or how to leaflet and target particular constituencies, I would think it would be a legitimate exercise. But if, let's say, her New Testament class said we're not having class today, and a substitute class was not scheduled so that the knowledge that was to be disseminated that day was replaced, then I would find that particularly objectionable.
And I agree, even just an example on that, when we had the teach-in impending to the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, we knew that it was going to be about a 24-hour window when it was announced. And I told my class, if need be, I will have an independent meeting with every one of you to have this class happen. But if the teach-in, as it was scheduled in the midst of our class, that I was going to go to the teach-in and invited anyone else to go, but the class would happen. And it did. I mean, I had to taught it twice or something like that. I agree with you, Ramón, that I think that it would be wrong not to carry out the business of the class and the contractual expectation there. But would it also be wrong, Gary, for me as a professor not to be able to participate in a campus event, a teach-in on that invasion, when for me, as an exercise of my citizenship, I thought it was important to be there? So that's our debate.
Yeah. It's something I struggle with because I think about this in terms of journalism also. Journalists, I think, face a similar question. They have their own personal opinions, but to the extent that they express them, it can really diminish their capacity capacity to perform the task of being a journalist. So I feel like it's hard to negotiate. I've done teaching myself, and I always struggle with this in terms of what political opinions, if any, do I express? Because I see my task more as helping the students to think through their issues. Is there almost kind of an asceticism that a teacher has to bring to the profession where I'm going to, in a sense, prohibit myself from being too political in certain ways in the service of education?
I would just make one observation. I teach political science courses, and so I encounter this quite a lot. The good thing about politics, though, is that both sides give us the opportunity to lampoon with equal abandon. So, Anissa?
So I'd like to come back to the description of the broadening understanding of academic freedom for faculty through a different lens, a civil rights lens, and particularly the university policy on unlawful discrimination and harassment, which does address in a limited way academic freedom, and says something like, in addition to meeting the definition of unlawful harassment, when academic freedom is an issue, the conduct has to be abusive, directed at an individual or individuals, particular individual or individuals, and serve no bona fide academic purpose. And so my question is an example might be a math professor expressing views about differences based on sex or sexual orientation, not having to do with the instruction of math. And how would the consideration of the thresholds that are spelled out in the policy, having to do with severity, pervasiveness, reasonable person standard, etc., what's the difference between the way that would be considered and, say, if it were a staff manager expressing the identical views in the workplace?
As I think the one who was the author of that language, which I didn't remember very well, I think what the rules are obviously trying to get at is that that in this respect, at least, a staff manager is like a employee of other organizations, businesses. That is that although members of the university staff do have, in my opinion, not technically academic freedom, but essentially the same protection as academic freedom because they are and choose to work in this environment which prides itself on having that kind of freedom. That therefore I believe a staff member is protected in putting up a button or bumper sticker by his place of work in the same way that a faculty member would. On the other hand, it's generally recognized in the law and consistent, again, with the First Amendment and consistent with organizations that aren't regulated by the First Amendment, that there are circumstances where face-to-face persistent harassment of an individual by another individual is subject to legitimate regulation. There are a variety of forms of expression that are allowed to be regulated, threats, commercial advertisements in university facilities that are not regarded as protected in the same way as political or religious or ideological or social discourse. And one-on-one harassment is recognized as an example of that, and a staff member who engages in that type of behavior towards a subordinate or some other employee could be punished. As applied to faculty members, that policy was designed to recognize that there's a particular gray area in the context of relations among faculty members or faculty and students, where what would otherwise appear to be harassment might in fact be legitimate as a form of academic, either educational or scholarly discourse. And therefore, what would otherwise be prohibited What might not be prohibited is it's done in the context of an academic relationship where there is a bona fide purpose for the expression. And so what it does really is, in this context, is to say that although most individuals in society and most individuals in universities can be held to account for this narrowly defined form of face-to-face, persistent, pervasive harassment by one person or another, which can take the form of all sorts of action. It could just be late-night phone calls that wake them up, or it could be following them around and calling them racist or homophobic or anti-Semitic names. That in the academic context, that you might in fact have a situation where a professor does something that looks like that in a classroom, where it actually has a bona fide academic purpose, and that would be an exemption from that. So I think what that represents is a very narrow exception to the general rule that harassment of the sort I've defined is forbidden in a university, but there are some circumstances what might look like harassment is actually legitimate academic behavior.
Can you give me an example of that? I'm just curious what you have in mind.
Sure. I actually sometimes will do this. So I remember one time I was teaching a First Amendment course, and a student was saying to me that there's no such thing as a fighting word. There's no such thing as a statement made by one person to another that would actually cause them to react violently. This person happened to be African American, so I called him a nigger. He got furious, and I made my point. So yeah, that was an example. I would say that was legitimate academic freedom. Might not have been the best way of making the point, but it worked. And even that student later said to me, yeah, you're right, I got it. So that's an example. Right? But if I did that in a different context, or without that reason, it would obviously be inappropriate.
I went to Wesleyan. Undergraduate at the University at the time, there was a shooting of a student at Wesleyan, and I've written all these emails from the university, right? The president speaking on as the university saying, this is really awful, here's a memorial service, we're all sad and we're taking a position, but we don't follow political rules about that, right? It's kind of like children, it's like for or against children, which is good. So my fear is that sort of aspiration to neutrality, right, keeps us sort of comfortably on our liberal world, almost not. Two more examples, right? So investing in, if we're going to aspire to neutrality, it means we divest from, distance from Sudan, or then we also have to do that for various non-profits or homelessness work in Hyde Park or something like that. Or is it okay if we invest in it but don't write it because then have a speech so that it's just a decision but we won't talk about it? Third example is the non-discrimination policy.
What policy?
Non-discrimination. Non-discrimination policy, right? So, as she was mentioning, so that speech that we protect these classes of people, but then the argument seems to have to be that, well, we should protect you as long as you don't say it online, because then that, or on the website or in a handbook, that's speech. So I have one more thing to say, which is this question about sort of recourse to the First Amendment or protection laws not, kind of typical, the critical race studies response 10 or 15 years ago, which I kind of disagree with. I think it's worth just discussing is why is it the fact that defamation is covered, corporate speech is covered, and thought is covered, and so you have all these sort of areas of speech where it's like the wealthy white guy is covered, right? But then when it's like hate speech or something like that, that's academic freedom, and so then there's a sort of weird pattern where what speech is sort of not connected to what is. And this is so.
So on the first example, which is can the university president speak at all? There's two answers. First of all, the university president is a person, can speak as an individual. But in any event, you don't want to trivialize the idea that the university can't speak. Obviously, the university can speak to perform its own non-ideological functions. So it can send out admissions material. It can talk about why you should come to the University of Chicago. I mean, it speaks in all sorts of ways that are not neutral. It says things like, Chicago's a great place. You should come here, right? But the point is, those are thought to be integral to the operation of the institution itself. You can't run a university without a certain degree of speech. And what we're talking in the Kalven report about is really political, religious, ideological, social statements that are not integral to the running of the university. And again, none of these distinctions is perfect, but that's the basis of the distinction. The second example was...
Well, I want to give you an example.
What?
I want to give you a different...
Just give the second example.
Investing. Like, so investing, if a lot of aspiring to college, that means that we don't put our money in anything. We might, various nonprofits or.
Oh, right. So again, the point is if you reach the opposite result that the university did in the Sudan situation, then you would be saying that we can choose, indeed maybe you'd say we have to choose, not to invest in any organization that we find morally repugnant. So then people would say, well, we should not invest in those organizations that provide supplies to abortion clinics. Or we should not invest in any organizations that have taken a position in support of the war in Iraq. Or we should not invest in any organization that does not recognize gay equality. Part of what the Kalven Report is designed to do is to say, no, we don't do that, right? We don't make those decisions, because once we open up the door to that, then we become vulnerable to every Tom, Dick, and Harry group that wants to demand that the university act in accord with their deeply felt beliefs. So the premise is that you don't want to make those decisions, and that's, again, like the ticking bomb, that's why you basically want to take a very strong stance on the fact that the university doesn't have its investing decisions for that purpose. And that doesn't mean the university doesn't invest in some companies and not others. The reason for doing that, though, has to be because it serves the financial interest of the university, not because the university is trying to make a political statement. That's the key difference. The third question you raised, I'm sorry, was... why there's some speech that's protected and other speech is not. You need a whole First Amendment course to sort of answer that question. And a whole bunch of answers to it.
It's offered over there.
Yes, it is offered. But the simple one-line answer would be that in order for speech to be regulated because the content of it, whether it's commercial advertising or false statements of fact in the context of defamation or whatever, is, among other relevant factors, is that it's not suppressing a particular point of view because it's a bad idea. So when you regulate false statements of fact, you don't care whether the false statement of fact is that that Bush beat his wife or that Bush goes to church every day. It's a false statement of fact, and it could be subject to an action. When you say that you can't make statements that are offensive to blacks or gays or Jews, you're immediately getting into the realm of saying there are certain ideas, viewpoints that are prohibited, and that's the fundamental difference. You can't.
I guess the First Amendment, maybe a sort of case law like in the saying we already are doing that. Maybe this is a long time, but the other thing I want to say is if one of you was very publicly defamed, right, in a Tribune or something, and the university said, it wouldn't be unreasonable, I think, right, from the website. The university said, thinks this article is wrong and wants you to know that it's false information, something like that, right? But I mean, I guess I'm sort of recycling these examples. But if the university said, we think torture is wrong, we think John Youth fabricated all sorts of stuff, and it's like bad for America or something, right? That's no go. So I guess my problem is to sort of read the First Amendment stuff. Like, well, the First Amendment said this is okay, this is not, but then kind of
it's not random.
Ramón or Margaret, did you?
No, the only thing I wanted to ask Jeff a question: how silence would be interpreted under the Kalven Report in terms of the university's administration when it chooses not to speak out on an issue that other universities and other moral leaders are taking positions on.
Silence is silence. It can be a position. It can be understood and intended as a position. But if it's silence, then it's not a position. Other people can interpret it any way they want. In the same way that if you decide not to create an engineering school, people can interpret that as meaning you don't think engineering is very good, or you don't think you can afford to build an engineering school, you don't need another engineering school. But silence is like any other act. People can read messages into it, but unless you intend it to be a message, it's not. For purposes of free speech and for purposes of the government.
Either unreflective about or
that even if I disagree with the position that the professor is taking, I feel entitled to speak what I feel. And I'll give you, this is my question, the circumstance in which I saw something come out, and I'm curious what you think about it. So I was TAing in a class. There was an international political economy class. And there was an article assigned, this is a number of years ago, and the article is on immigration. And it called out in particular the issue of Latino immigration in the United States. So in the TA section, I made a point of writing the words racism and prejudice on the board and just asking the class what the difference between these terms were. And essentially saying, and then discussing the article, not necessarily only with respect to these questions, but I wanted to bring into the discourse the idea that some students might be offended by the position that was being taken on immigration in this article for these particular reasons. And I wanted that to be something that we could talk openly about if students wanted to talk about it. And when I went back and spoke to the professor and he asked how the section had gone, I told him what I did and he reprimanded me and said that that was not the point of the course and that those were not the subjects that I had biased the class into thinking that they should interpret the article that way by raising those issues. And I'm curious what you think of this situation.
Well, I want to be careful not to have, having not been in the context, there's so much I don't know and couldn't understand. I think as a discussion group leader, maybe I would ask it back that would it have made a difference if you had said to the professor, well, actually, I taught this last year, and this is what came out in the discussion, and therefore I knew we were going there, and so I sought to anticipate it by offering some terminological distinctions that I thought might anchor the discussion in a more valuable way. I mean, this is a tough call for anyone who teaches discussion group style. Ideally, or maybe, or at least a very good pedagogical outcome can be when such things emerge from the group and not only top down from the instructional staff. So therefore, it's not only you that's sort of saying, we really need to talk about racism when we talk about this. But sometimes you have to make a call. And so I wouldn't say, that you made the wrong call in that moment. What would be interesting and important to know is, did the group go with you there, and was there, did the group debate it? So that if the group said, I really don't think, if some member of the group said, this is not what this is about, and others, in other words, then it's an educational moment. So, I think discussion group learning requires both guidance, but it also, the group has to take some ownership over where it wants this discussion to go, and you have to make some decisions.
I would only say that you're probably referring to Sam Huntington's work, right? And I think all you'd have to do is go on any website or do a Google search to see how much catalytic response that book and its excerpts have provoked, particularly among Latinos in the United States, who are essentially depicted as individuals that are going to destroy the fabric of American society. They're going to create a separate Quebec. They're going to secede from the Union and form independent republic. That they'll never integrate and learn the language. This is, I teach the work, but I teach it as part of, xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment in American society, which we know is prominent in this time and space. I'd say where I'd probably differ in terms of teaching the article is that my University of Chicago students get very upset at me because I always require them to write a one-page response to every reading that they do, in which they have to give it to me at least 6 hours before the class so that I can see what their responses have been to any particular reading. And then I try to structure the conversation around their individual responses because, as you know, in many classes, it's going to be dominated by the aggressive young men who are going to drown out any other conversation. And so frequently you can't get people that are shy, many of the women to participate in the same way that the men participate. And so this is the way I have a record of all the responses, and then I essentially draw everyone into the conversation, laying always some ground rules as to how you have a conversation and dialogue in a class, that this is not a debate where you try to drown out somebody else's voice or silence someone else, but essentially part of our deliberative democracy and teaching as an art of democracy.
Hi, my name is Toussaint Lucia. I'm one of the current vice president for student affairs here at the university, outgoing vice president for student affairs. And I was really glad you guys passed around the Kalven report, because I've always been interested in this third page, the special comment. And
George Strickler.
Which says, university, when it acts in its corporate capacity as employer and property owner, should, of course, conduct its affairs with honor. Right? And I was wondering just if you could inform us in terms of what mechanisms exist to ensure that the university is conducting its affairs as an employer and property owner with honor, particularly as I think recent events have shown sort of how weak the mechanisms of faculty governance. This is supposed to be a faculty-run institution, but the sort of mechanisms of faculty governance can be at times. And I remember some of the debate that happened around the establishment of the Milton Friedman Institute for Economic Research. And there was a faculty senate meeting, and it was the first faculty senate meeting in I think 8 years or something along those lines. And the faculty senate meeting originally was supposed to discuss this issue, and then the debate of the MFI was constricted in such a way where it was actually quite limited in terms of one, how much time could happen, how much time there was for debate, and then two, the fact that the faculty couldn't actually make a decision on the issue in that particular meeting. And I wanted to know if you could speak to that question of what mechanisms are we looking at that have, and I know this is the sort of like dissenting view of the report. It's not, it's not within the body, but it's still considered, it still was printed out as the rest of it. So what sort of mechanisms exist for that? And how do we, as a community, ensure that the university as a corporate body is acting with honor as an employer and as a property owner, whether it means its land holdings or its stock investments?
So it's an understandable mistake to say this is a university, a faculty-run university. It's not. No university is. It's a trustee-run university. The trustees are the university. The university faculty are employees. We'd like to think of ourselves as special employees, but ultimately we're employees. And the Board of Trustees, as in all universities, that's what makes them universities, gives those employees a certain amount of decision-making authority, or at least the authority to recommend decisions on matters directly related to the academic mission of the institution. But not on matters that relate in business judgments, to economic decisions, to real estate investment policies. They often will invite faculty to weigh in on these things, but those are not matters that the faculty decides. So it's important to understand the relationship between the faculty and the governance and the Board of Trustees. It is ultimately the Board of Trustees that is responsible, by the way, not to the Kalven report, because the Kalven report is simply a faculty report. It's not a statute at the University of Chicago. So even that isn't binding on the Board of Trustees itself. The Board of Trustees has adopted it implicitly as a policy of its own. But basically the answer is that the board grants, and the statutes of the university grant to the faculty a large degree of decision-making authority on matters that are thought to be directly related to the academic mission of the institution. But ultimately the authority rests with the Board of Trustees, and on matters dealing with non-academic decisions, the Board of Trustees generally doesn't delegate authority to the faculty.
So there's no.
I know that's surprise to most faculty members, but it's true.
Is there any mechanism that faculty members, students, other employees of the university have to ensure that at this point, right?
It's called free speech.
No, but in terms
That's it.
Okay.
That's it.
So that's so that is the mechanism.
Yeah, you can complain, you can
You can
persuade, you can vote, you can leave, you can criticize.
You can have your forums. You can write letters to the trustees.
Right.
You can talk to the alumni to pressure the trustees. You can stage demonstrations on the quad.
And they pay attention to those things, up to a point.
Just to follow that up briefly, if you look at, and I appreciate Professor Gutierrez bringing up the protest, demonstration, what have you. If you look at the university's rules in terms of how protests can occur, that form of free speech is actually predicated on, various different rules, right? In terms of that form of, if you want to protest, if you want to have a demonstration, is very much contingent upon, you have to get prior approval beforehand, if you want to use amplification in the quad or other area, it has to be during.
But that you would be asked to do the same thing if you're trying to have a demonstration on the streets of Chicago before Mayor Daley would allow you to do it.
I understand that, but what I'm saying is that the sense I'm getting is that the mechanisms that one would have to raise those concerns are very much constrained and are very much limited. And if we want to ensure that that's happening, particularly with the history of the University of Chicago, in which there have been instances in which the university, and I'm sure we could clearly agree that the university has not acted in honor in its investment, whether it's the support for restricted covenants during the 1930s, 40s, the urban renewal that took place in Hyde Park in the 60s, that there are clear instances when that hasn't happened, right? And that there's been questions upon, we can look back later on and say, what sort of mechanisms were there to actually ensure that there was some sort of check or some sort of space in which people could say, is what we're doing appropriate? Is what we're doing actually fulfilling at least this question of the university should be an institution that actually does?
I think you underestimate the power that students that have, the power that the parents of students have, the power that alumni have, particularly in dealing with the institution. I mean, having been an administrator, I know that if 10 alumni complained to the president of my institution about anything, that issue would be on the president's agenda very rapidly. He'd call in his vice presidents and his deans to discuss the issue. He'd probably hold an open town meeting with the students to see what the grievances were, and some attempt would be made to resolve it in some mutually acceptable way. So, I mean, I do think that the institution is more open than you imagine it to be. Perhaps you're intimidated by the architecture, and perhaps you're intimidated by the architecture.
Perhaps. But I don't want to draw this out, but that those seem to be things that have to happen on an ad hoc basis. And I know, for instance, other institutions have built-in mechanisms into the way in which the university functions to ensure that there are ways that there's a constant review, right, of university actions to make sure that these things are happening.
Well, again, I mean, I came from 30 years at the University of California where we had a very bureaucratized way of a system of shared governance where faculty could express their opinions on everything and anything that occurred in the institution. But the main problem is that faculty were apathetic. Nothing would ever come out of these committees. The committees would just grind on, and the issue would disappear before the faculty could deliberate on it or express some kind of opinion. It was always like, I think it was President Eisenhower hated two-handed advisors on the one hand and on the other hand, and therefore there was no answer.
So when you say there needs to be some form of review, the thing to understand, there's always got to be a final decision maker, somebody. That's the Board of Trustees. They are the Board of Review.
I think we're at 1:30. Thank you all very much. It's been a very interesting time.